Village of the Small Houses, a memoir of sorts, written and read by Ian Ferguson.
Here's a word that you don't know. Wahio. It means, literally translated, a long time away. Indian word, Bush Cree. It neatly combines a long time ago and a place far away, but it has more significance than that. The thinking behind the word refers to a long distance traveled, both physically and chronologically, and what such a journey does to the person traveling. It's a good word, great word. It's where we're going to start. A faraway place and a long ago time. Wahio. We're in the north. Not the Arctic, but as far north as you can get in Alberta before you bump into the territorial boundary. The true north. Up there. The middle of nowhere. It is snowing and it is cold and there isn't a whole lot to see. There are trees, scrub pine mainly, and there is a narrow road that twists and turns as it cuts through the forest. A rough stretch of dirt that, at the best of times, isn't in good condition. Right now, with the snow coming down and the wind blowing and the ice forming, this road is in the worst shape it ever gets. This is a road that a seismic crew chopped out of the woods sometime back in the 1930s, and no one has bothered with the upkeep on it since then. If you were driving it, you'd want to be behind the wheel of a big transport truck or an all-terrain vehicle. Maybe a tank. And even then, you would creep along and drive as carefully as you could, because this road doesn't want you on it. The sun is going down and the trees are tossing shadows across the road. At any moment you could veer into those trees, end up wrapped around them, tangled in their branches, and you'd want to die in the crash because the alternative would be to slowly freeze to death. It's that cold out. Believe it or not, there is an automobile on this road. It is not a tank or a truck of any kind. It is a 1953 four-door, two-tone, green and white Mercury Zephyr, and it isn't creeping along either. Despite the conditions, this car is flying, fishtailing out of curves and bottoming out in the rough patches, and the wheels are spitting up rocks and gravel and frozen chunks of mud, and the light from the headlights is stretching out through the darkness and dancing off the trees. The car is barely staying on the road. That's my father behind the wheel. The windshield wipers are snapping back and forth, thudding out a contrapuntal rhythm to the beating of his heart and the pounding in his head and the harsh, convulsive, gulping breaths he's taking. My father is no longer driving the car, not really. He's just sort of aiming it, and if he thought for 1 second about how close he is to the edge, he'd have to stop the car in the middle of the road and throw up. That's my mother lying on the back seat. She's not enjoying the ride. She is being bounced and tossed around, and she would dearly love to tell my father to slow down and take it easy, except she can't seem to get the words out. She's a shade over 8 months pregnant. She's in a world of pain, and she is so ready to have the baby that she thinks maybe slowing down wouldn't be such a good idea after all. Even so, if she could manage to sit up and look out, if she could really see how my father is driving, she'd probably tell him to stop the car in the middle of the road and let her out. "Hold on, Louise! We're almost there!" The baby my mother is expecting is me. It is early in November, and I'm not supposed to arrive for another 2 or 3 weeks, but it doesn't matter. I'm in a hurry, and so are my parents. Not only because I'm showing up unfashionably early, but also because they are trying to catch the last ferry across the river. This isn't the last ferry for the day, which would be bad enough. This is the last ferry going across for at least 6 months, maybe as much as 9. It depends on what kind of winter is in store. The Fort Vermilion ferry boat landing sits where the mighty Peace River bends and turns to the north before heading back down south again. The landing is also known as the Narrows, because the Peace River is only half a mile wide at this spot. That's why they put the ferry crossing there. The river is well over a mile across at the widest sections, and it is fast. This river moves. It doesn't matter how quickly it goes, however, because this is the time of year when the cold beats it. The temperature drops, and ice begins to form, and at a certain point the river is simply impassable. The ferry is pulled out of service, and everybody waits for the river to freeze solid. It takes at least 3 weeks for the river to ice up, maybe as much as 6. Depends on how cold it gets. If I'd waited long enough, the ice bridge would have been ready and my parents could have driven to the hospital right across the top of the river. That was the original plan. Well, hell, men make plans and God laughs. That's the big joke. The road makes one final bend, one last attempt to send my parents into the ditch, and then it heads straight downhill towards the river. They've made it. They are at the crossing, and nobody could say they didn't do it in record time. And there is the ferry, sitting on the shore waiting for them. So far, so good. That's what my father is thinking now, and he keeps repeating it to himself. So far, so good. He's planning to jump the queue and go to the front of the line, and his hope is that the operator will let him onto the ferry and then push off, leaving everybody else waiting for the next trip across, if there is one. That's his plan. Since this will be the last ferry run until spring, most people in the area have already laid in supplies and prepared themselves to hunker down until the ice solids up. Everybody knows better than to wait until the last minute. So there are only a handful of people waiting to board the ferry boat. There's not a lot of room to maneuver, but he manages. He skids to a halt right at the edge of the landing and jumps out of the car. He is thrilled to see that the fellow in charge of the ferry that evening isn't that prick Joe Beck, as my father always refers to the manager of the Fort Vermilion and District Ferry Service. It is Bud Pean, which is a huge break for my father. Bud Pean is driving the ferry. Bud Pean is my father's faithful Indian companion, his loyal sidekick. What they are, racial differences notwithstanding, is friends. Bud Pean is also the only person in the entire North who can look down on my father, literally. Bud stands 6 feet 8 inches high, which makes him 3 inches taller than my dad. They are both big men, but that's where the similarities end. Bud Pean is broad across the chest and solid throughout. My father is so lean that Bud Pean used to say he'd have to run around in a rainstorm just to get wet. Bud, we've got to leave. We've got to go. Let's get moving. Let's go. Let's go. Right now. Right now. My father keeps talking that way, in one continuous sentence, not making a lick of sense, which is a little unnerving for Bud Pean. My father is also speaking in a high-pitched, squeaky voice, which is disturbing in itself. His eyes are wild, and his whole manner makes it look as if he's gone off the deep end. He might even be dangerous. Bud Pean would normally just knock a crazy person cold, drop him in his tracks. But this is my father. He is teaching Bud Pean to read and write, and Bud considers my father to be the smartest man he's ever met, even if he's not actively demonstrating that intelligence right now. Bud spots my mother in the back seat. She is struggling to sit up, and Bud holds up one enormous hand to get my father to stop speaking. Then he ambles over to the car to see if maybe my mother can explain things. He leans over to chat to my mother, bending himself nearly in half. He's hoping she'll say something that will make it easy for him to excuse my father's rude behavior. "Louise?" And this is Bud Pean now. "What's the... Oh, my good God!" Bud takes one look at the condition my mother is in, and he gets the message. Bud may be a big man, but he can move fast when he needs to, and he leaps into action. He swings open the door on the driver's side, picks my father up by the scruff of his neck, and throws him into the car. Bud kicks the car door shut with a gigantic boot, then races down to the ferry. "We got an emergency!" This seems straightforward to everyone on the shore, and there is nodding and shrugging from the people who have lost their place in line. Sure, has to be something important. Why else would Bud Pean move that fast? "It's the school teacher and his wife. She's got to get to the hospital right now." This sends everybody back into their vehicles, which pleases Bud Pean no end. He's already waving my father onto the ferry. It takes finesse on my father's part, since he has to get the Zephyr in on an angle to avoid the first pickup truck, and the loading platform is bucking and swaying. The moment the back bumper clears the lip of the ferry, Bud slams the safety gate closed and heads for the wheelhouse. The last thing Bud Pean yells before the belch of the diesel engine drowns him out is, "Don't worry, we'll come back for you." What nobody knows is that Bud Pean, a man renowned for his honesty and character, has just lied. The truth of the matter is that every single person waiting on the banks of the Peace River is going to have to make other arrangements. This wasn't a deliberate lie on Bud Pean's part. He simply has no way of knowing that the ferry isn't coming back. Ever. The Fort Vermilion and District Ferry is a paddle wheel boat. There's not much to driving the thing. There isn't any steering involved. A cable takes care of that. And the only trick is remembering to turn off the engine at the right moment so that you don't come up too hard and crash into the opposite shore. Bud Pean has been running the ferry for over 3 years, and he is proudly crash-free. In fact, he has a reputation as the best ferryboat operator working. He can glide that ferry into a landing so gently, you don't know you've stopped. My father isn't convinced they've started. He heard the motor turn over and the paddle wheels start splashing, but the ferry doesn't seem to be moving. He gets out of the car to make sure they are well and truly underway, and it is only when he can see the shore slipping away into the darkness that he relaxes enough to finally light his cigarette. He notices that someone is getting out of the only other vehicle on the ferry. He can barely make out the shape of the person, but the voice is unmistakable. "Bud, what the hell are you doing?" It is, of course, that prick Joe Beck, now waddling over to the wheelhouse. If my father hadn't been so distracted, he would have recognized that prick Joe Beck's station wagon as being the only other vehicle that had made it on board. "You can't take off without a full load." It is obvious that Joe Beck is not too happy about what is going on, and he has a point. Fully loaded, the ferry can take 6 cars, or 4 trucks, or 2 hay wagons, or any combination of the above. 1 station wagon and 1 sedan isn't anywhere near a proper trip. Bud Pean comes out on the deck and tries to think of something to say that will calm things down. The problem is that Bud becomes a little tongue-tied around white people, having grown up with the idea that they are in charge of the world. And here he is trying to explain himself to the supervisor of the Fort Vermilion and District Ferry Service, who is not only white, but also Bud's boss. "Now, Bud, you've got to turn this boat around." "Well," this is all Bud Pean says. "Bud, damn it, this is the last run. We're not going to leave those folks stranded." Bud is having the same problem he has whenever someone is mad at him. He can think of what to say. It's there in his head, but it somehow seems to get stuck in his throat. "That's it, I'm telling you. That's it. I will go and turn the thing around myself." This is when my father decides to get involved. The idea of turning the ferry around not fitting into his plans, he steps in between Bud Pean and Joe Beck. "Listen," my father says, "you shouldn't be angry at Bud." He is prepared to go into a perfectly good explanation of why, but he never gets the chance. "Damn it, Hank," says Joe Beck, "this is none of your business. You go back and sit in your car." To emphasize his seriousness and his anger, Joe Beck stabs my father in the chest with a pointed finger. My father is not a fighter. He is more of a talker, but he's at the end of his rope, and enough is enough. He grabs Joe Beck by the arm, his fingers sinking into the doughy flesh. He lifts him off the deck and half drags, half carries him over to the Zephyr. Bud Pean can't believe his eyes. He's never thought of my father as being a man of action. But there you go. My father throws the little man against the side of the car, then leans over until their faces almost touch. "Joe," my father says in a tone so even and reasonable that it is terrifying, "have you ever delivered a baby?" He grabs Joe Beck by the arm, his fingers sinking into the doughy flesh. He lifts him off the deck and half drags, half carries him over to the Zephyr. My father throws the little man against the side of the car, then leans over until their faces almost touch. "Joe," my father says, in a tone so even and reasonable that it is terrifying, "have you ever delivered a baby?" "What? No, of course not." "Well," says my father, "you're going to have to, because my wife is about to give birth right here and right now if you don't keep this ferry boat moving." For emphasis, he twists the little man around so that he can see my mother in the back seat. He may be a prick, but even Joe Beck is able to figure out what's going on. He breaks free of my father and races over to Bud Peehan. "Bud, put this son of a bitch into high gear! The school teacher's wife is going to have a baby!" "That's what I was trying to tell you." Bud is in the wheelhouse so fast it seems as if he's vanished off the deck and reappeared inside the cabin. He is switching the gears so hard they're grinding, which makes him wince. But the goal is to get to top speed as quickly as possible. The paddle wheel starts slapping the water in double time, and it looks as if the ferry is going to set a record for making the opposite shore. Then the slats on the wheel start coming off. The problem is the ice has already started forming. Chunks of frozen river are making their way downstream, most of them still fairly small, 8 or 9 inches wide, 5 or 6 inches deep. Normally, they wouldn't be dangerous, but at this speed, they're bouncing against the paddle wheel, cracking the wood, and the momentum of the wheel is sending bits and pieces of wood flying through the air and into the water. It's strangely beautiful. "Jesus! Hank, we gotta slow this down." "Joe," says my father, "you do that and I'm going to have to hurt you." This may be a bluff, but Joe isn't taking any chances. He looks over at Bud Peehan, takes a second to catch his breath, then calls out in his loudest voice, "Never mind, Bud! Let him rip!" So Bud Peehan lets it rip. It's not so bad. A few pieces of wood broken off? Shouldn't be difficult to fix. The piece of ice that kills the ferry has been floating down the Peace River for several days, bobbing in the current, making itself a little larger as the temperature drops, bumping occasionally into the shore. Eventually it will reach a width of 3 feet or so and a depth of close to 5. At the lowest speed possible, the ferry can handle 1 or 2 larger pieces of ice. The bow usually nudges them away from the paddle wheel, or the ferry boat operator eases them out of the way with a metal pole kept expressly for that purpose. But get too many of these tiny icebergs in your path and you aren't going anywhere. The big chunk of ice misses the bow of the ferry and runs into the paddle wheel just as a slat clears the water. It is very dramatic. The paddle wheel lifts partway out of the water, high enough for Bud Peehan to identify the problem, then it stops turning. The diesel engine is working so hard to keep the flywheel moving that it starts to smoke. Bud is trying to dislodge the ice when he realizes the motor is in trouble. "Joe," he says, "can you do me a favor?" Bud Peehan is still relentlessly polite. "Could you turn off the engine?" It is the worst landing Bud Peehan has ever made. The paddle wheel is twisted and bent, and this has turned the ferry sideways so that instead of drifting straight into the waiting dock, the boat comes up over the edge. It is apparent that the motor should have been turned off earlier because the ferry lands with, if not an actual crash, enough of a thump to shake everybody up. The boat is wedged high on the landing for a moment or two, and then it slowly grinds backwards, tearing off the few remaining slats on the paddle wheel before shuddering to a halt. My father starts his car. He rolls down his window. "Joe," he says, "could you stand up and get that gate dropped?" The loading door is wrestled into position. My father bounces the Zephyr off the ferry and heads up the hill. Since the roadway on this side of the river is nicely graveled, he stands on the accelerator. He is doing 30 miles an hour by the time he reaches the top of the hill, 40 by the time he reaches the Fort Vermilion turnoff, and over 50 by the time he passes the experimental farm. He doesn't touch the brakes until he reaches the doors of St. Teresa's Catholic Hospital. He's out of the car and into the hospital, and he gets those nuns moving. They can tell he's serious, and they have my mother in the delivery room in no time flat. My father doesn't go in with her. That wasn't done in those days. But he's pleased to be there. He's going to make up for the fact that he was out of town when his first child was born and... Shit! The first child! My father leaves the following message for my mother. Tell Louise I forgot the baby clothes, so I've gone back for them. The bag of hand-me-down baby clothes I'm supposed to wear home from the hospital is, in fact, sitting in the trunk of the car. My father hasn't forgotten the baby clothes. He has, however, forgotten the baby. My parents have been given free housing by the Peace River Separate School District as part of my father's employment. They live in what is called a teacherage across the river from Fort Vermilion in a scattering of houses known as Rocky Lane. These aren't luxury accommodations. They are single-room cabins without electricity or plumbing, heated by a wood stove, and not particularly well insulated despite the climate of the area. To keep the floor warm in the winter, you have to surround the house with bales of hay and then bank snow up over that for insulation. There is an outhouse for use in the summer and a chemical toilet for indoor use when the weather gets too cold. My father found the idea of the river freezing up confusing at first. If he lived on the other side of the river, he asked Jean Rogers, principal of both the Indian and the separate schools, how would he get to work in the winter? Well, Hank, Jean Rogers said, you can bunk in with one of the teachers in town, or you can wait across the river for freeze-up to finish. With all due respect, Jean, if I wait across the river, I won't be doing any teaching. Hank, Jean Rogers said, and this was intended as a dismissal, these are Indian kids. It doesn't matter if you teach them or not. They don't learn much. Back at the Fort Vermilion ferryboat landing, Bud Pian has just lost his job. Which is a blow, no doubt about it, but not nearly as shocking as seeing my father drive back down the hill. Bud is really surprised by that. He goes over to my father. Well, you were ever quick. Then he notices my mother is no longer in the car. Hank, is everything okay? Actually, Bud, no. I need to go back across the river. Hank, that's not going to happen. The ferry's shot. Paddle wheel is busted up. Motor ain't working. Joe had to drive up to the RCMP, get them to radio across to the park ranger. He's going to drive down, tell those people we ain't coming back. Even if the ferry could take the trip, I wouldn't be driving it. I'm through. Well, you see, Bud, here's the problem. I left my son at my house. Wait a second. He fired you? You left your boy all alone? They're each a step behind in the conversation, there being a lot to take in. Yeah, he fired me. That little prick, my father says. Bud Pian is thinking really, really hard. Geez, Hank, how could you do that? In the panic and confusion, I clean forgot him. How could you forget your own son? I didn't do it on purpose. Didn't Louise notice you didn't bring him? She should have. She was the one who got him dressed. My father was still trying to shift the blame. She left him on the bed before I put her in the car. That's terrible. That's why I have to get back across the river. Hank, it's impossible. My father plays his ace. Bud Pian has been coming over to the teacherage every Sunday for the past 3 weeks for dinner and reading lessons. He has already chewed his way through the alphabet. Bud, it's the same thing I said when you told me you didn't think you could ever learn to read or write. My father pauses to light up another cigarette, letting this sink in. Nothing is impossible. And that's how my father and Bud Pian ended up taking a steel-bottomed rowboat across the Peace River during the fall ice formation. Twice. The boat comes courtesy of the Hudson's Bay store manager, and making the trip is foolish and dangerous and necessary. They cross at the foot of the old factor's house, rowing with the current, and make good time. They don't talk much on the first crossing. They are both a bit concerned about my brother, Dan. It takes some doing once they land, but my father convinces Surrey Cardinal, who has been abandoned on the far shore, to drive them to the teacherage. Dan is still sleeping when they reach him, right where my mother left him, warm and comfortable, and they bundle him up and take him back down to the rowboat. The sun is starting to come up. The trip back has one or two truly scary moments when the ice comes out of nowhere and spins the boat, and my father has to stop rowing and grab my brother to make sure he stays in one place. My brother is only slightly over 3 years old and sleepy. He doesn't say much at all. On the way out, in the darkness, the entire town lined their vehicles up on the riverbank and shone their headlights for a beacon. Even that prick Joe Beck. They are still there waiting when my father and Bud Pean step out of the rowboat with Dan. Nobody applauds or cheers, but everybody is happy they made it. It is mainly an Indian crowd, and they aren't much for cheering and clapping, though they do nod with appreciation for the risky adventure the two men have survived. Bud Pean and my father stop to catch their breath when they reach the top of the hill. Bud grins and shakes his head. "Hank," he says, "you're probably the smartest person I ever met, but what we just did?" "Yes, Bud?" "That was the stupidest thing ever." I was born on either November 3rd or November 4th, depending on who you want to believe. My mother gave birth a couple of hours after midnight on November 4th at almost exactly the time my father and Bud Pean were starting across the river to pick up my brother. My father would always insist that I was born on the 3rd, though, and that's what it says on my birth certificate. He's the one who did the paperwork. He was in the hospital on November 3rd, so technically he was there for my birth. I guess that made sense to him somehow, some way. The argument continued long into my adulthood. At the same time I was being born, give or take a few hours, Lloyd Loonskin was also coming into the world. He was born at home in his grandmother's cabin. There was much less excitement surrounding his birth. He had been an easy pregnancy, even though his mother was only 16 years old when she had him. Lloyd Loonskin's grandmother was the only other person around to welcome him. It's a good thing she was around. 3 months later, Lloyd Loonskin's mother walked out onto the frozen Peace River and laid herself down. She never got up again. I was born lucky. He was lucky to be born. That made all the difference. My parents ended up in the true north because of certain events that happened one day in March in Edmonton in the same year I was born, 1959. On that particular day, my mother was sitting in a rocking chair gazing out a window. The window my mother was looking out belonged to a 4-story building right downtown, in the heart of the city, as they say. The building was named McDougall Court. McDougall Court rented out what used to be called cold water flats, single rooms with a shared bathroom down the hall. No pets, no cooking, no liquor, no Indians allowed. My mother was pregnant with me that March, and I was already causing her a whole world of problems. Most obviously, I was making her sick morning, noon, and night. On this particular day, however, she was enjoying her first non-nauseated afternoon in 3 weeks, courtesy of a kindly old doctor she'd gone to see at the free clinic. My mother had walked over to the free clinic a few days earlier, carrying my brother. After a lengthy wait, the doctor said he had something that would fix her right up. It was a new drug and not widely available in Canada, but he happened to have some samples. It was called thalidomide. My mother had taken her pills, and now she was feeling fine. It was a good day. That was the thought in her head. What a good day. Then my father came home. My father didn't come into the room the way he usually did, with a smile and a joke and a promise about how prosperity was just around the corner. He picked up the straight-back chair that sat next to the bureau, turned it around and wedged it under the door handle. Then he slid the bureau against the door as well. He didn't seem panicked or nervous or even in any kind of hurry. He seemed methodical. This might have been an attempt to keep my mother from getting worried, but it had the opposite effect. "Hank," my mother said, "what's wrong?" "Pack up the boy, Louise. We're leaving." "Why are we leaving?" "I can't go into that right now." "Where are we going?" "You know, I don't really have a plan yet, but we have to leave right now." My mother didn't know what was going on, but she did know that someone or something was going to be at the door soon, and she didn't have any intention of sticking around to find out what they wanted. She ran around the room, frantically packing up her baby gear, not to mention her baby. They exited through the window and started down the fire escape. The next phase of the operation was to reach the car, the 1953 green and white Mercury Zephyr. They took a different route than usual to get to the garage where the car was parked, going through some alleys and across an empty lot. "We can't go south," my father said. "It only takes one phone call, and they'll have someone checking every car on the way to Calgary." "So," my mother said, "we won't go south." "Same thing with east or west," my father said. "The only way to get out of town is along Jasper Avenue, and they'll have that covered as well." "That only leaves one direction, Hank." Her remark had an immediate effect on my father, who broke out in a grin. "Exactly," he said. "We'll head for the north." He leaned over to give my mother a kiss on the cheek, started up the engine, swung the car around, and headed up 97th Street. A decision had been made. They were going north. Here's what my father hadn't told my mother. Although a position with Investors Syndicate had brought my parents to Edmonton from Regina, my father hadn't lasted long at that job. He was a good salesman, my father, but with one child to support and another one on the way, he believed he needed a faster way of making money than selling insurance door to door. 2 blocks away from McDougall Court, a new office tower was under construction. The garage my father parked his car in was west of the building, and he used to stop in and chat with Ned, the night watchman, on his way home from making his rounds. One night, he cajoled Ned into letting him into the building. He got a complete tour of what would obviously be much in-demand offices when they were completed. He and Ned hit it off, and my dad had this great idea. A real get-rich-quick scheme. Here's how it worked. My father quit his job with Investors Syndicate, spent most of his last paycheck printing up nice stationery and embossed business cards, and went into the office rental business. He would make a cold call, something he was good at, hand people his card, and offer as a convenience to his customers to show them around the new high-rise after hours so they wouldn't be distracted by the construction. If a client liked what he saw, my father would do up a letter of agreement on his stationery, take a small deposit, and wave goodbye, planning to be out of town well before the building was finished. He rented out one corner office to 12 different people. It was easy money, involving very little overhead unless you counted the cost of the stationery and the business cards and the 10 spot my father slipped the night watchman every time he unlocked the door with a cheerful, "Good evening, sir, and how are you today?" The only problem was construction on the building finished early. A client of my dad's showed up for an unannounced visit, and the next thing you knew, my father was leading his pregnant wife down a slippery fire escape in the middle of the afternoon in the rain. So those are my parents. That's my mother, and that's my father. And later, there they sit in the 1953 two-tone Mercury Zephyr, having made it as far as the town of Peace River. "Hank," my mother said, "what are we doing here?" My father didn't have an answer other than to explain that here was as far as they'd been able to go. "Hank," my mother asked, "what happened in Edmonton?" My father did have an answer to this, only he didn't feel like sharing it at that moment. Finally, my mother asked the biggest question. "Hank," she asked, "what are we going to do now?" "Louise," my father said, "this is what we're going to do. I'm going to walk over to that garage and buy some gas. I'm going to bring it back here in a jerry can. I'm going to put it in the tank of the car. Then we'll take a look around and find us a nice motel to stay in." And that's what they did. They ended up at the Bide-Away Motel up on the hill leading out of town. The room was cozy enough, and it was certainly a big improvement over their place back in Edmonton, and it was a bargain at $9 a night. Luckily, my father kept unused checks from closed bank accounts for just such a situation. He had already written a check at the gas station, and now he wrote one to pay for their room. They went for Chinese food. He paid by check. After lunch, he took my mother and my brother back to the motel. "Hank," my mother asked when she realized he wasn't taking off his coat, "where do you think you're going?" "Out," said my father. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." My father headed back towards the downtown corridor of Peace River and did something he hadn't done for a long time. He went to find himself a bar. My father had made my mother a promise. He had told her he was never going to drink again. Or, to be exact, that he would never have another drink as long as they were together. He spotted a sign for a licensed room, pulled into a parking spot off Main Street, got out of the car. My father squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped into the Bruin Inn. "I'm sorry, we're not open yet." "Oh." My father stood in the direction, blinking, confused, not sure which direction to turn. "What's a well-dressed young fella like you doing looking for a drink at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for, anyways?" It was a good question, and my father decided it needed a good answer. He told a tale, and it was a clever one, being very close to the actual events that had occurred. It was a touching story. My father was probably setting him up for a loan. After that tale of tears, the barman was sure to cough up a few dollars. "Salesman, eh?" the bartender commiserated. "That's too bad. Not a lot of call for your line in these parts. It's too bad you're not a teacher by trade. The Peace River separate schools are desperate for teachers." My mother heard my father drive up in the car. He was just in time. She'd started worrying. She had good reason to be concerned. Her husband had left her and her baby alone right after lunch, and now it was dark. Nighttime, really, way past the dinner hour. What if he was gone forever? What if she'd been abandoned? She threw open the door to the motel room. "Where have you been? I'm worried sick." "Louise," my father said, "I've got a job." Not only a job, either. He had also found them a place to stay, and he'd done it in one day. After hearing about the tragic shortage of school teachers in the Peace River Separate School District, my father had driven over to the district offices and talked his way into a meeting with the district superintendent. He was able to spin out a tale about a young husband and father, a teacher by profession, a Catholic even, who was vacationing with his wife and family, one kid, another one on the way, and had fallen in love with the North. The superintendent hired him on the spot. The Peace River Separate School District was that desperate for teachers. The Peace River Separate School District covered an immense area, reaching all the way to the territorial border, and where they could really use someone of my father's qualifications, it seemed, was at the Indian school in Fort Vermilion. My father had no idea where that was, so the superintendent pulled down a wall map. "This is where you are now," he said, pointing at Peace River with a ruler. "And Fort Vermilion is where, exactly?" The ruler began moving north on the map. "Look up," said the superintendent. "Look all the way up." My father was explaining this to my mother over a meal at the Golden Dragon Chinese and Canadian Cafe. He was holding my brother Dan on his lap, bouncing him up and down. They need teachers so bad, they want me to start right away. I thought you hated teaching, my mother said. I do, but this is a temporary situation. We're going to go up for a few months, a year at the most. And then I'll come up with another plan. And where are we going to live? That's the best part. The school district provides housing. They're going to put us up in something called a teacherage. Which is what, exactly? It's a house, Louise, my father said. We're going to live in a house. Fort Vermilion is 526 miles north of Edmonton. If you took the trip today, you'd find that most of the highway is in pretty good shape. You can go as far as high level before you run out of pavement. The roads were more demanding when my parents made the trip. It didn't help that the rain seemed to be following them, though as they made their way north, it changed into sleet and then snow. The roads also got worse and worse as they went. Blacktop gave way to gravel, the gravel became dirt, and just as they reached high level, the dirt road changed into a single muddy and slippery rut. My father double-checked his directions with the fellow pumping gas, happy to learn their destination wasn't much farther away. What time, my father asked, does the ferry stop running? 10 o'clock, on the nose, the attendant said. If you miss it, they don't start up again until morning. They finally reached the crossing. Coming through the darkness, they could hear the sound of a motor chugging and the slapping of a paddle wheel. It was the last ferry, and it was the best sound they could have heard. Then the motor stopped, and the boat glided into the shore. The door to the wheelhouse opened, and out stepped the biggest Indian my father had ever seen. Bud Pean was an imposing sight, especially coming off the deck of the ferry. "Hello," my father said. "We thought we'd missed you." Bud Pean wasn't much for small talk, especially with people he didn't know, especially with white people he didn't know. He started tying the ferry up to the dock, which was confusing to my father. "Excuse me, is this the last ferry?" Depends. Depends on what?" "Well," said Bud Pean, "it's the last ferry for the night, but it's not the last ferry for the season." My father gave my mother a look of triumph. My mother spoiled his mood by asking her own question. "Are you," she said, "going to take us across the river?" "Nope." "Why not?" my father asked, dumbfounded. "'Cause I'm the last ferry coming from that direction. The last ferry going to that direction was at 10 o'clock. "I'm sorry," said my mother, "but there has to be some way for us to cross. My husband is the new school teacher. We have to get to our, what's it called, Hank? A teacherage. Can you help us?" "Depends." "On what?" My mother jumped in quickly. "If you want to cross the river, I can't help you. If you want to go to where you're staying, I can help you." This left both my mother and my father at a complete loss for words. "See, the school is on that side of the river." He pointed to help them understand. "House they've put you up in is on this side of the river." My mother broke the silence. "You can take us to where we're supposed to go?" "Sure." Bud Pean turned and walked to his pickup truck. My parents exchanged a look, then scrambled to get to their car so they could follow him. Before she got in, my mother had a thought. She called out to Bud Pean. "This teacherage," she said. "Is it nice?" "Depends on what you're used to." Since my father and mother and brother had ended up in Fort Vermilion, it seemed only decent for me to join them. My dramatic birth was followed by some dramatic early days. I had underdeveloped lungs and all sorts of things wrong with my stomach and intestines. I couldn't breathe. That was the real problem. We did a lot of traveling together, my mother and I. By the time I was 9 months old, the two of us had been flown down to Peace River 3 different times on what they called air evacs. The third time down, I was placed in an iron lung for a weekend, while the doctors tried to figure out what was going on with my breathing. I wasn't doing enough of it. After much consultation and not a little hand-wringing, they gave my mother the following diagnosis: we don't know what's wrong, and we don't know how to fix it. My mother and I were sent home with the implied understanding that she shouldn't get too attached to me. I had what appeared to be severe asthmatic symptoms, but the traditional treatments were not working. After their first winter, my parents were tired of the commute across the river. My parents bought some land, and my father spent the first part of his second summer in Fort Vermilion clearing the trees. Bud Pean did most of the actual work. My mother provided the architectural design. The house was built on a foundation of split-beam logs. It was sturdy, but you couldn't find a single corner that was perfectly square. Bud Pean had helped to build a few houses over the years, but he was no master carpenter. My father was afraid of heights and remarkably clumsy with a hammer. Work went slowly. My mother maintains the house would never have been finished if it weren't for the assistance of an elderly Mennonite named John Weeb, who passed by in his horse-drawn wagon every morning on his way to the Hilltop Mission. After watching the progress for most of the summer, he took pity on my father and showed up one day with his tools. He became the foreman of the project, and the three men finished the house before the first snow. The house had been carefully cleaned to keep sawdust from interfering with my breathing, and my parents were relieved when I made it to my first birthday. My family celebrated the occasion in a proper manner. My mother baked a cake. My father borrowed a camera from Scott Wagner, the manager of the Hudson's Bay store, and I stopped breathing. Again. My father squeezed in one photo of me sitting in front of the cake, my eyes wide as I stared at the single candle. But then it was time for another panic trip to the hospital. What made this trip different from our previous outings was that my brother wasn't brought down to St. Teresa's to wait. Instead, my dad dropped my mother and me off, then took Dan over to a neighbor's. This would turn out to be a significant move. While my parents hovered at my bedside, my brother was busy being sad over at the Noski house. "How come you don't want to play?" Lucy asked. "Because I'm sad," my brother answered. "How come you're sad?" "Because my baby brother is sick." "How come he's sick?" "Nobody knows." There was a long pause while Dan thought this over. "I think he's going to die." "Oh." Lucy pondered this statement. "Well, you should take him to my grandpa. He'll fix him." "Really?" "Oh, yeah. He can fix anybody, unless they're really old." Lucy, having solved the problem, then went to tell her mother that something important was going on. The two of them had a conversation in Cree, so Dan didn't know what was being said or decided. But he remembers what happened afterwards. He got bundled back up along with Lucy, and the two kids and Lucy's mom went for a long walk. Then they got into a truck. Then they went for a long drive. Then he fell asleep for a while. Then he woke up again and they were still driving, but this time they were in a different truck. Here's what happened at the hospital. There was a commotion outside the emergency room. One of the doctors was yelling something. There were sounds of a struggle, and then the door to the room was wrenched open, and the first thing my mother saw was my brother Dan, not safely at the home of a playmate, but here at the hospital, surrounded by a horde of Indians, none of whom she'd ever met before, and man, were those Indians loud. They were chattering away in Cree, talking a mile a minute, and then, just like that, silence. That's when Lucy Noski's great-grandfather, it could even have been her great-great-grandfather, entered the room. He was plenty old in any case. He was already rumored to be over 100 and would go on to live for another 15 years, so who knows? He was, in fact, the last of the old medicine men, the end of a line of traditional Aboriginal healers that stretched back 1,000 years or more. Unlike regular doctors, medicine men were responsible for the spiritual health and well-being of their community, not just the physical. None of this was known to my mother, but the reverence that the rest of the Indians showed for the old man were enough to alert her that something was up. The old man said something in Cree, and a younger man in his mid-40s stepped forward to translate. This is Augustus Noski. I'm his grandson. He says you got a sick boy. My mother nodded. My grandfather may be able to help him. That's when the penny dropped. My mother took another look at the old Indian. He caught her eye. There was something in his face that my mother trusted. Is your grandfather, She paused. She felt silly asking the question. Is he, a medicine man? You betcha. This was said so simply and with such conviction that she had to believe it. Augustus Noski wasn't saying a word, but he kept his gaze level on my mother. Can he help my son? This required another conversation between grandson and grandfather. He says maybe, but I'll have to take a look at him first. What on earth is going on here? The man asking that question was Dr. Gopishand Usman, and he was, after Augustus Noski, the oldest person in the room. Dr. Usman was a recently retired microsurgeon from Bombay, India. He had taught at prestigious medical schools in England and South Africa, and he hadn't enjoyed his retirement. Despite his credentials and his experience, the only hospital that offered Dr. Usman a job was St. Teresa's. He had been in Fort Vermilion for 6 months, and he had already made himself known. He had gone to the hospital board soon after his arrival and laid down the law. They had responded by putting him in charge of St. Teresa's. What is that man doing to my patient? Augustus Noski had bent over and was carefully removing me from the oxygen tent when Dr. Usman marched over and grabbed his arm. The crowd literally gasped with shock. Augustus Noski shook off Dr. Usman's hand and said something directly to him in Cree. His grandson translated, but the tone was clear. My grandfather says if you lay hands on him again, he'll put you in the ground. Tell your grandfather, if he touches my patient again, I will see he is put in jail. My grandfather wants to know if you're a healer. Tell him that I am a doctor. My grandfather says he thought a doctor was the same thing as a healer. It is, and I am, and he is putting my patient at risk. My grandfather says you've put the boy at risk. Oh, does he? At that moment in the confrontation, my mother stood up and stepped in between the two men. That's enough, she said. Do I have to knock your heads together? Dr. Usman reared back, managing to look insulted and amused at the same time. A moment later, once his grandson had finished translating what my mother said, Augustus Noski had exactly the same look on his face. Dr. Usman, my mother said, this man is an Indian doctor. He wants to take a look at my son. I have given him my permission. I don't see what harm it could do. Dr. Usman thought that a witch doctor giving my mother false hope was extremely harmful, but he wasn't a cruel man, and he couldn't think of any way of telling her that. He nodded his assent. Augustus Noski took me out of the hospital crib and placed me in my mother's arms. Then he began to poke at me. His movements were economical and brisk. After he finished his examination, he looked grim, and he had a long conversation with his grandson. He was obviously saying something controversial because the other Indians either looked shocked or nodded in agreement. My grandfather wants to know if you wanted this baby. I love my son. Do you understand me? If you're not going to help, then go away. My grandfather says he's sorry. The reason he asked is that this boy has been poisoned. It is some poison that you took while you were carrying him. Now he believes you didn't know you took this poison. He feels maybe someone evil slipped it into your tea. Poison? Dr. Usman was back to being a disbeliever. Good grief! Dr. Usman, my mother said, please be quiet. She talked directly to the translator. Can you ask your grandfather, since he knows what is wrong, if he thinks he can help my son? There was a long consultation between Augustus and his grandson. My grandfather says he can only help the boy if the boy wants to keep living. Dr. Usman had reached his limit. And how on earth is he going to determine that? The answer to his question came immediately. Without warning, Augustus Noski took me from my mother's arms, holding me by the heels and the back of my head. He lifted me straight up until his arms were fully extended. I arched my back to keep from falling. Jesus Christ! What the hell is going on here? That was my father. He had made his way through the crowd inexplicably gathered in the emergency room. Then he felt someone tugging at his pant leg, and he looked down to see his older son staring up at him. "Dad," said my big brother Dan, "it's okay." "Your boy wants to live. That's good." That was the translator. The old medicine man said something, and the room became quiet again. "My grandfather says you aren't Indians." "No," my mother said, we're not." "So your boy has no Indian in him?" It wasn't a question. "No, of course not." "Well, you know, this is old-time Indian medicine. It only works if you're an Indian." My father would have said something, probably something that would have worsened the situation, but my mother spoke first. "Are you saying you won't treat my son because he's not an Indian?" There was a short conversation, almost an argument, between Augustus Noski and his grandson. Then the medicine man turned back to my mother, and his face wrinkled up in a smile. His grandson translated. "He says no problem. We'll turn him into an Indian." "When will you do that?" "Oh, don't worry. First we'll fix him, then we'll change him." And that's what happened. Augustus Noski fixed me. He had my parents check me out of the hospital and take me to his house, where his wife made everybody tea, including Dr. Usman, who had given in to his professional curiosity. I was carried out back into a small, solidly built cabin, where the medicine man did some things with steam and smoke and herbs and other stuff. Nobody knows because nobody else was allowed into that cabin. He filled a mason jar with some foul-smelling green liquid that my parents were supposed to give me 3 times a day, and that was that. My mother asked if she needed an appointment to bring me back, and she was surprised by the answer. "My grandfather says give him the medicine and he'll get better." My parents both tried some of the green liquid when they got home. It tasted as bad as it smelled, but it didn't make them sick. So what the hell, they figured. It couldn't hurt. They'd find out later that the green stuff was a medicinal tea. The biggest ingredient in it was rat root, which grows in swamps and sloughs and is the foundation for a lot of traditional medicine in northern Alberta and Saskatchewan. Augustus Noski and his grandson showed up at our house the summer before I was set to start school. I was 6 years old then, and they were finally getting around to closing that loophole. It was time to turn me into an Indian. "My grandfather says we got to get it done before he goes to school," the grandson said. "Otherwise it might not take." They had pulled into our yard in their old truck, and they seemed in a hurry to get going. My parents weren't invited to come along, and my father had some concerns about this. "What exactly," he said, and he was choosing his words carefully, "will be involved in this, transformation?" The grandson translated the question. Augustus Noski chuckled and spoke directly to my father. "He says not to worry. It doesn't hurt or anything," the grandson translated. Augustus Noski was still chortling to himself as the 3 of us drove away. He finally turned to me and said something. "My grandfather says it doesn't hurt to turn into an Indian, but he says it can hurt being an Indian." I had no idea what that meant, so I asked, "What does he mean by that?" "Don't ask me. He's the one who said it." The beaver and Cree used to bury their dead on platforms in the branches of trees. There were practical reasons for this. The frozen ground made it hard to dig graves, and placing the newly deceased up high kept them safe from most scavengers. But the real reason not to bury people was because when you die, your spirit goes up into the sky. What we call the Northern Lights is actually the spirits of all the Indians who have passed away dancing in the heavens. If you're lucky enough to see them in the real North, the true North, you'll get to hear the music they dance to as the Northern Lights murmur and crackle. The Aleski Shrine was built into the side of a hill across the river from Fort Vermilion, just beneath a cemetery. The cemetery on top had 1 or 2 proper grave sites and a few Christian crosses, but the majority of the plots were spirit houses, which is what the Indians called the buildings they erected over their dead. The spirit houses ranged in style from miniature log cabins to tiny wood-framed cottages. Most of them had been painted white or covered in mud that had dried the color of whitewash. All of them had a spirit hole. The cemetery was beautiful. It looked like a village of small houses. We stopped at the Aleski Shrine that day after I was turned into an Indian. Augustus Noski hadn't lied to my parents. The ceremony hadn't hurt at all. They took me to the sacred place, and they taught me a song, and then they told me the history of the people. The history took a long time to tell, but it was never boring. A lot of stuff had happened. They made me promise to learn the language and pass it on to my children. That seemed easy enough. I was surrounded by people speaking Cree, and I had already picked up many words. We climbed up from the sacred place and sat outside and had some sandwiches. Then we got back in the truck. "Is it over?" I asked. "That's it," the grandson said. "My grandfather just wants to make one more stop." We sat looking at the Aleski Shrine for a long while before the medicine man said anything. When he started talking, he spoke so quickly it was hard for his grandson to keep up with him. "A long time ago, this priest was sent up here to teach everybody about Jesus Christ. He didn't like the spirit houses. He said it went against the church. He hired some men and they knocked down all the spirit houses and they put all the people in the ground. The next week, nobody showed up at his church. And the week after that, nobody came again. And that went on for a while until the church got rid of this priest. They sent him down south where he wouldn't have to deal with the people. The next priest built this shrine here for the mother of Jesus Christ, and he put all the spirit houses back. He did this by himself. Nobody would help him." I was listening to Augustus Noski tell me something. I knew it was important. I was trying to figure out what the lesson was. "That priest was Father Litzler, and he's still here in Fort Vermilion today. That's why we like Father Litzler. And also why Indians should stick together." Augustus Noski and his grandson drove me home after that. There wasn't much conversation, but every once in a while Augustus Noski would reach over and mess up my hair. He smiled every time he did this. When we got to my house, they both came in and had tea with my parents. A few months went by before my father realized he must owe somebody something. He went to Bud Pean for advice. "Bud, how does payment work with a medicine man?" "You don't pay them, Hank. You give them a present." "What kind of present?" "Tobacco is good." "I should take him a pouch of tobacco?" "Jeez, he saved the boy's life, Hank. I'd at least give him a carton of tailor-mades." 1967. That was the year it snowed every month, even in July. That was the year I became a big brother. And that was the year that Canada threw a party and we weren't invited. The rest of the country was preparing to celebrate the centennial. There were going to be fireworks and speeches and a giant get-together in Montreal. The year even had a theme song, Bobby Gimby's ode to 1 Little, 2 Little, 3 Canadians. Most of Fort Vermilion had never heard the song, though. Our closest radio station was CKYL in Peace River, which played country music mainly, sometimes Western. When the atmospheric conditions were right, their signal made it north to us. If you had a radio, you could sing along. If you had electricity. The town's power supply came from 2 generators, one of which was turned off every night. Most houses couldn't afford electricity. Even the families who could flip a switch and turn on the lights likely felt that a radio fell into the category of unnecessary luxury item. The folks at the experimental farm were there to do scientific research, though, and they not only had electricity, but a big outdoor antenna. They could listen to the radio any time they wanted. Those folks were excited about Expo 67. So were our teachers, so was Scott Wagner, the manager of the Hudson's Bay store, and most of the other people from out. The rest of us didn't care too much about it. As far as we were concerned, Canada was fictional, a kind of dream. Imagining Canada was like thinking about England or the United States or Australia or other places we were never going to get to see. It was all the same to us. We didn't even go over to the fairgrounds to watch the Dominion Day show Scott Wagner had organized, which was just as well. It stormed. This wasn't a brief snowstorm like the one we'd had in June. This was wind and sleet and temperatures that dropped below freezing. Nobody in town liked the cold. What was there to like? This was called a cold snap. It didn't make any difference if you were measuring the temperature in Celsius or Fahrenheit. It was hateful. You didn't dare go outside without every inch of your body covered because exposed flesh would freeze in an instant. It was fingers, usually, that would go first. You had to have good gloves. Earlier that year, in the middle of a cold snap, during a stretch of record low temperatures, I had taken my mitts off momentarily to get a better purchase on the only swing set in the schoolyard. I froze my right hand onto the metal. This was after classes had ended for the day and it was already getting dark. The only person available to help was my friend Lloyd Lunskin. "Hey!" I said. "Ouch!" I said. "That stings!" And again, "Hey!" I was trying to get his attention. Lloyd Lunskin was swinging fearlessly from the crossbar 12 feet overhead and it wasn't easy for him to hear me. "Ouch!" I was much louder this time. Lloyd stopped himself in mid-swing and hung effortlessly from the crossbar. "What's wrong?" "I froze my hand, Lloyd. I'm stuck." Lloyd Lunskin dropped down onto the ground. He made the descent look easy and painless. He floated. His feet barely seemed to touch the ground. "Hey, partner, what's wrong?" "I told you." I was becoming alarmed at the fact that I couldn't feel my fingers. "I froze my hand." This earned me a disgusted roll of his eyes. He was completely not impressed. "Well, what were you taking your mitts off for anyways?" I confess that by this point I had tears in my eyes. And it wasn't only from being cold. Since my face was completely wrapped up in a scarf with my eyes barely visible, I was hoping he wouldn't notice. No such luck. "Hey, partner, you crying?" "Look, my hand is stuck. You've got to go get some help." "Just pull it off." "No, if I pull it off, all the skin is going to come away." "Well, so what?" "Well, I'll bleed all over my coat." "So?" "My mom will get mad at me." Lloyd couldn't argue with that. He didn't have a mother to call his own, so he placed great importance on mine. In later years, when he was grown up and living far away, he would sometimes call her on the phone. Mostly he'd be sober, but sometimes not. She could always tell when he'd been drinking. He'd call her Mummy. "Well, what do you want me to do?" "Get some warm water and pour it over." "Where am I going to get some warm water?" My mother always kept a stew pot of warm water on the stovetop. It wasn't for drinking. It was to create humidity. "Go to my place, Lloyd. My mom will give you some water." "Okay." And he was off, flying across the field. He was running so fast and the sky was getting so dark that it was mere seconds before he vanished completely. I was left all alone. My hand, which had grown numb on the first frozen contact with the steel, began to hurt. It felt as if I'd fallen into a patch of stinging nettles. I was seriously considering pulling my hand away, ripping it off fast like a bandage when I spotted him racing back out of the night to save me. He was running full tilt, legs churning through the snow, arms pumping. Wait a minute, arms pumping? "You dummy, you didn't bring any water back?" I was so mad I took a swing at Lloyd with my free hand. Talk about being let down. "I'm sorry, partner." "Don't say sorry, you dummy." Calling Lloyd Lunskin a dummy was the greatest insult I could come up with. I knew it would hurt his feelings, but I didn't care. I never even went to your place, he said. Think it through. If I go to your house and tell your mom I need some warm water, she's going to want to know what for, and then she's going to ask me where you are, and what am I going to say to that? It made perfect sense, and I was furious I hadn't thought about that myself. The whole reason to pour warm water in my hand was to keep my mother from getting mad at me. He was right, and I was wrong, but I didn't feel like letting him off the hook that easily. You couldn't have come up with a story? You know I can't lie to your mom. And there it was. He wasn't incapable of telling a lie the way Bud Pean was, but he could not and would not tell my mother anything but the absolute truth. Don't worry, partner. I got an idea. And that's when Lloyd Loonskin peed on my hand. Well, first he had to climb halfway up the post, and then he had to hang on with one gloved hand, and then he peed on my hand. He didn't bother explaining his solution to me first, and that was probably for the best. I might have chosen instead to leave a layer of skin behind on the post, and that would have been painful. Lloyd's solution wasn't painful, but it sure was embarrassing. The thing was, it worked. The cold metal that had grabbed onto my right hand released its hold, and I was able to pull away without too much damage. My fingers had turned waxy, and they were a disturbing tobacco color. I couldn't feel anything. There was a deep blue line running at an angle from my index finger onto my palm where the rough edge of a welded seam had pressed itself deep into my hand, but that didn't seem like anything to worry about. I retrieved my woolen mitt and set about warming my hand back up. The nerves would spark with pain when my hand finally started thawing out, and the damage from the frostbite, although minor, would be permanent. My right hand still tingles and goes numb with the slightest drop in temperature, and I have the remnants of a thin scar running across my finger and into my palm. Mind you, I had no way of knowing this at the time. At the time, I was just happy there wasn't any blood. I didn't want to get my mother upset. Lloyd Loonskin and I headed back across the snow to my house. I was still angry about the solution he'd come up with, and it didn't help matters when he started laughing. Then it occurred to me, he wasn't going to tell anybody about me freezing my hand or crying because he wouldn't want me to tell people what he'd done to rescue me. Once I'd figured that out, I started laughing too. We were laughing so hard we kept falling down, collapsing into the snow, and this would make us laugh even harder. We would pull each other over backwards trying to get up, and that would make us laugh until it hurt. I can't believe you peed on my hand! Hey, we're partners, right? When we finally got to my house, we both went inside to warm up. My mother made us some tea. I soaked my hand in the pot of warm water on the stove. My mother didn't ask why I was doing this, although she must have known something was up, because Lloyd Loonskin and I kept bursting into laughter every time we looked at each other. Every time my mother asked us what was so funny, we'd start laughing again. Forget blood brothers. Getting your hand soaked with pee was the true test of friendship. Lloyd Loonskin and I had met for the first time on our first day of school. I was surrounded by a group of Indian kids who were discussing how to beat me up. Fort Vermilion had a fairly rigid, though unwritten, system of class distinction. The Indians considered themselves to be above the half-breeds, and both groups looked down on anyone who claimed to be Métis. Bud Pean once said, in reference to a certain member of the Lizotte family, he'd lose all his French blood if he cut his finger. Nobody gave the Mennonites much thought. The rest of the white people tended to work for the government, or the school district, or some other symbol of authority. They lived in houses that had power, and most of them had indoor plumbing. They came from out, and they either went back where they came from as quickly as they could or gave up and settled in. The white population of Fort Vermilion lived in 3 separate enclaves. The suburbs up the hill from the Hudson's Bay store and Stevens General Store, on top of the hill in school district teacherages, or on the road leading out of town at the experimental farm compound. If an Indian kid or a half-breed kid beat up a white kid, there were usually consequences. My family, though, was an anomaly. We were white, but we lived right in town. We lived in a house that had no electricity and no plumbing. We were poor. We were fair game. My brother Dan had already gone through this. Despite his close friendship with Lucy Noski, he wasn't exactly a popular kid. He was big, though, large for his age, and while he wasn't much of a fighter, his size made him difficult to knock down. That was one thing you could say about my brother. He could sure take a punch. By the time I started school, Dan was more or less being left alone, which suited him fine since he preferred solitude to the company of other people. I, however, wanted to make friends. I wanted to be popular. The first day of school ended, and I was running home full tilt when the ground suddenly jumped up and slapped me in the face. I had been tackled by one of the Mitchell brothers, Willie, or Warren, or Walter, I wasn't sure because they all looked alike. Also, they had grabbed me from behind. It didn't matter anyway because I was quickly covered by almost the entire grade 1 class, all of whom started pummeling and kicking me. This recreational activity was called piling on. How it worked was, one kid would yell out, "Let's pile on so-and-so," and everybody else would participate in a group beating. You could make it stop only by saying you quit or by starting to cry. Both were considered satisfactory endings. Unwritten rules are the easiest ones to break. I had no idea about the etiquette involved in getting everybody to stop hitting me, but I was bound and determined not to start crying. Here I was, 6 years old already, in school. It was time to behave like a grown-up. I didn't start crying and I didn't beg them to stop. Instead, I fought back. This wasn't a good decision. I don't think I actually made contact with anybody, but the kids did stop punching me. In fact, everybody climbed off me and stepped back. As I slowly got to my feet, I hoped for a moment that my act of bravery would gain me my freedom, make me part of the gang. It took one quick look around for me to realize neither of these things was going to happen. "You think you're tough, eh?" It was Ted Carrier asking the question, and he didn't give me an opportunity to respond. He punched me in the face, hard. Hard enough to make me stumble and almost fall down again. Hard enough to make my mouth bleed. I was pretty sure that faces were off limits during pile-ons, but Ted Carrier had escalated the hostilities, and I didn't see any way out of my situation. He punched me again in the face, and this time I went down on my hands and knees. Then he kicked me in the side of the head. "Hey, stop it." I couldn't tell who was speaking, but there was a general murmuring and muttering going on in the crowd. I looked up to see who was coming to my defense, and that's when I saw Lloyd Loonskin for the first time. "None of your business." Ted Carrier wasn't backing down. "Sure it is," said Lloyd Loonskin. "You can't kick somebody." He shook his head. "That's cowardly." "Yeah, well, you're cheeky and black, you." That was a big insult, since Lloyd Loonskin was Cree and Ted Carrier was Métis. The full expression was cheeky and black like a slavey, since they were darker skinned. Lloyd Loonskin got an odd look on his face, not angry so much as contemplative. Ted Carrier mistook that look for weakness. "And," Ted said to Lloyd, "you got no mom." It was apparently an open secret that Lloyd Loonskin was more or less an orphan and that he lived with his grandmother. Not having a father was nothing to be ashamed of, but not having a mother was unusual. Most kids at least had a mother. It was a cheap shot, especially considering the way Lloyd Loonskin's mother had died, and it wasn't the smartest thing Ted Carrier could have said, not that he would prove to be a Rhodes Scholar anyway. "Hoof!" said Ted Carrier. Lloyd Loonskin had punched Ted Carrier in the stomach so hard he doubled over and hit his face on the ground. "Let's pile on Lloyd Loonskin," said Warren Mitchell. "Hoof!" he added a second later. Lloyd Loonskin was 2 for 2. Warren Mitchell was trying to catch his breath, and Ted Carrier had started crying. It was a beautiful sight. "You want me to hold him for you?" Lloyd Loonskin was offering me the chance to punch Ted Carrier. I took my time crafting an answer. "No," I said finally. "Look at him. He's just a little crybaby." And everybody laughed. They all started laughing at Ted Carrier. Probably I should have taken Lloyd Loonskin up on his offer, given Ted a good punch, and then I wouldn't have ended up making myself a mortal enemy that day. But that's hindsight. My younger brother Sean had been putting up a fuss that afternoon. My mother had him on her lap, bouncing him up and down gently and singing to him in a quiet voice. She almost dropped him when the front door banged open and in I came, my jacket torn and dirty, my mouth bloody, my left eye already starting to swell up. I had somebody with me. "This is Lloyd Loonskin," I said with the biggest, bloodiest smile you could imagine. "He's my best friend." The year I turned 9, we had to move because my father got fired. Gene Rogers, tired of my father's insubordination, had looked at his original job application and uncovered my father's lack of a proper teaching certificate. The jig was up. Gene Rogers gleefully passed the information on to the school board, and my father was dismissed on the spot. It was the talk of the town. The white people were outraged by my father's deception. The Indians were outraged that he had lost his job. They all thought my father was a fine teacher, and they didn't see what a piece of paper had to do with his abilities in the classroom. My parents had spent 10 years in Fort Vermilion. 3 of their 4 sons had been born there, they owned property, and they had recently fixed up their house. But they had very little money left. My father needed to find some other way to support his family. He spent a few miserable weeks working on a road crew south of High Level, but he wasn't good at it. He cashed 1 paycheck, and that was that. Next, he talked Bud Pean into accompanying him to the Northwest Territories to see if there were any jobs available on Hay River or Yellowknife. There weren't. My father returned home with confirmation that he was completely unsuited for what he called the rewarding and challenging field of manual labor. This was meant as a joke, but my mother didn't think it was very funny. Things were starting to feel tense around our house. "Henry," my mother said, "we can't go on like this. You need to find a job, a real job. We need money. When the wolf comes calling at the door, love flies out the window." Or at least that's what my father always said. He'd mumble it under his breath whenever my mother brought up the family finances. But he decided he had no choice. He had to go back to teaching. He wouldn't be able to work for Gene Rogers anymore, but the public school was hiring. Once he had the proper accreditation, he'd be able to get, as my mother had put it, a real job. My father was accepted into the University of Saskatchewan in Regina. He was going to earn his degree, become a legal teacher, then come back, as he told my mother one night when he thought we were asleep, and shove that diploma right up Gene Rogers' ass. The decision was announced to us the next morning at breakfast. It was a relief to hear the news. We were going south. We loaded up the car the next morning. My father wanted to board up the windows and put a padlock on our front door, but my mother told him not to bother. She didn't think anybody would come into our house while we were away, and he ended up agreeing. Or maybe he just didn't feel like doing the work. It's not as if we had much to steal. You might think a long drive in a car full of kids would be unpleasant. It wasn't. Everybody was excited, and every time we passed through a new town, my brother Sean would announce, "Well, we've never been this far south before." We sang songs and took turns telling stories, and we were having a wonderful time. Then the Zephyr started making a clunking sound. My mother and father paused mid-smile. "What's that noise?" my mother asked. "It's nothing," my father said. "The car's never made that noise before," my mother said. The clunking got louder, then it stopped. "See?" my father said. "It's nothing." "I think you should pull over and take a look," said my mother. My father rolled his eyes. I could see him in the rearview mirror. But he pulled the car over to the side of the road, turned it off, got out, and opened the hood. The rest of us gathered around as he stood pretending to look at the engine. "What's wrong with it?" My mother was holding up my brother Billy, who wanted to see the motor. "Seems fine," my father said. "Who needs to go to the bathroom?" We all did. So off into the bushes we went. We got back into the Zephyr, and my father put the key in the ignition. The motor didn't turn over. It did make a coughing noise, more like a death rattle, and then it was silent. "Wonderful," my father said, and then to my mother, "You're the one who wanted me to stop," like it was her fault. "You're the one who drove the car up into the territories," she said, like it was his fault. We had to push the car before it would start. My father shoved on the open driver's door. My mother stretched her leg over and put her foot on the clutch, and Dan, Sean, and I threw our combined weight against the rear bumper. The motor finally caught, and at the moment it sputtered to life, my father climbed into the car to keep it running. It kept moving, too, and Dan, Sean, and I had to chase after it, pull open the rear doors, and scramble inside. "The next time we have to do that," my father said, "let's make sure we leave the back doors open." My mother looked over at him. "It'll be easier for the boys to climb back inside," my father said. We didn't have to push the car every single time we stopped. Unless we were getting gas, my father would leave the motor running. My mother would race into a store to buy food, and everybody would charge into the washroom and out again as quickly as we could. Eventually, though, the Zephyr gave up the ghost. We'd driven all the previous day and through most of the night. The sun was starting to come up again. Everybody was asleep, except for my dad and me. "Welcome to Saskatchewan," my father said. I said. I was awake, but still sleepy. "We just crossed the border," my father said. Clunk! That was the Zephyr. The sound wasn't that loud. It was the silence that followed that woke everybody up. We spent the morning in Lloydminster when my father tried to figure out a way to get us back on the road. He couldn't afford repairs, so he went off to find someone to con. It didn't take him that long. We'd only been waiting in the car with my mother for a few hours when he showed up riding in the cab of a bright yellow tow truck. A moon-faced man was driving. Fred Koch operated a garage in Lloydminster. I don't know what kind of line my father had fed him, but it must have been a good one because he didn't tow us to his shop. He took us to his farm on the outskirts of town. His wife, Lena, was waiting for us, and she seemed even friendlier than Fred was. She brought all of us into her kitchen for soup and sandwiches and fresh milk right from the cow. By the time my father came out to the barn to collect us, he had moved our bags and belongings into a midnight blue Volkswagen station wagon. The station wagon was parked right next to our car, facing the direction of the highway, and it was about half the size of the Zephyr inside and out. We all squeezed into the car, barely, and my father made sure we all said a proper thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Koch for their hospitality. My father had said something to Fred Koch about making sure he had his address and getting in touch soon. If the Volkswagen was a loaner, though, we never gave it back. The trip became fun again, even in the cramped circumstances. We deked around Saskatoon and kept going south, all the way to the Standing Buffalo Reserve. My father had got a job teaching adult education classes there on weekends, and free housing was part of the deal. We moved into a prefabricated house on the road leading into the reserve, across a field from the school. My father commuted to Regina to attend university. He had a full course load, and he also graded papers for any professor who would hire him. Actually, my mother did the grading. Standing Buffalo was nothing but rolling hills and prairie grass. Not a tree in sight whichever way you looked. Small houses were tucked up in the hills and hidden in the valleys. It was so different from Fort Vermilion. Even the Indians weren't like the ones we'd grown up with. These Indians were Sioux, descendants of the survivors of the great victory of Little Bighorn who had chosen Canada as a new home. They didn't look beaver or Cree. They looked like the Indians in movies. They wore their hair long and braided. The people were poor, that part was the same, but they were also friendly. We'd barely moved in when the first kid arrived asking me if I wanted to come out and play. By the time the summer ended, Clyde Uzichipi was my new best friend. School began, and I fell head over heels for Mrs. Grey Eyes, the first Indian school teacher I'd ever met. Our new sister came home from the hospital with my mother, which seemed to be how those things worked. We fell madly in love with Lorna Joan, who was round and wrinkled and who giggled and gurgled and who was given the unfortunate nickname of Pruny by our father. He said she looked exactly like a prune when she arrived, and the name would follow her into adulthood. My parents brought Lorna Joan home from the hospital, but my mother hadn't actually given birth to her. Lorna Joan's birth mother lived on the reserve. She was pregnant. She didn't believe she could raise the baby. She and my mother were friends, And that was that. The Christmas we spent on Standing Buffalo was our best one ever. Not because there were lots of presents under the tree, but because we were having such a splendid time. We would have enjoyed our life in Saskatchewan if we'd stayed on the Standing Buffalo Reserve. But we were only there for one summer and half a winter. My father got tired of traveling back and forth, so he quit his weekend job teaching adult education and picked up some work teaching night classes on campus. We moved to Regina on New Year's Day, 1969. Suddenly, we were living in the big city. Everything seemed to speed up. My parents got caught up in the spirit of the times. My mother found a job managing the first daycare center at the university, and she became friends with a pair of fanatical Marxist-Leninists with the last name of Gortney. They had a son they'd named Gorky. Gorky Gortney. How would you like to go through life with that handle? I'm willing to bet he long ago changed his name to something sensible, like George. My father, in addition to working on his degree and teaching night classes, wrote articles for Regina's alternative newspaper, The Prairie Fire. They hired my brother Dan as their editorial cartoonist, and it is a widely accepted family legend that Dan was investigated by the RCMP, who were a tad surprised to discover he was only 13 years old. We lived in the north end of Regina at 1211 Retallick Street. It wasn't a good address then, and it hasn't changed. The house reeked of our poverty. We may not have had much money in Fort Vermilion, but we never missed a meal. There were times on Retallick Street when we went to bed hungry. My mother's salary from the daycare and the money from my father's night classes didn't stretch far enough, especially now that we didn't have free housing. My father started coming home later and later. He was barely around. I don't remember my parents fighting during this time. They simply stopped talking to each other. One time my father simply didn't come home. He was gone all day Saturday and all day Sunday. We were in bed asleep when the front door slammed on Monday night. It made the walls shudder. My father was trying to be quiet, but we could hear him as he came stumbling up the stairs. He went room to room to give us all a kiss goodnight. I pretended to be asleep, but I could smell the alcohol on him. He went in to join my mother, and they had a long, hissing argument that lasted well into the morning. The argument continued for the next few days. My mother had decided she didn't like Regina, didn't like the people my father was hanging out with. She wanted to go home. My father thought this was ridiculous. What did she want him to do with his life? Be a school teacher, for God's sake? He was meeting people, smart people, important people. That's why he stayed out so late. Didn't she see that everything he did was for the future? There were opportunities for a sharp fellow like him here in the city. What he needed was some support, and if my mother would stop being so negative all the time, if she'd stop being such a wet blanket, things would work out fine. So much love, so little understanding, said my father. He tossed that at my mother, and it shut her up. About 5 years ago, I got around to asking my mother what had really happened in Regina. She took a while to think about it and then responded in a thoughtful manner. Your father got tired of the long con. Those first 10 years we had together were the best 10 years of my life, but he was only pretending to be that person, to be a good husband and a good father and a good teacher, and after a while he couldn't pretend anymore. When we moved to Regina, he decided it was time to pretend to be somebody else. We left Saskatchewan before the end of our second summer there. My mother packed us up and took us away. We were traveling. We were heading home. I regaled Lloyd Loonskin and anybody else who would listen with stories about my adventures in the big city. The city may have been Regina, but it was bigger than Peace River, and most of the kids in town hadn't even been there. Some of the white kids had been to places like Toronto and Calgary, and we hadn't gone to Edmonton. We'd only driven through, but I didn't care. I wasn't trying to impress the white kids. There was a store that sold nothing but comic books, and we got to go to a movie theater, a real movie theater, and you could ride a bus and go all over the city, any place you wanted, and there was a place right around the corner from our house where you could take empty pop bottles, and they would give you money, and the guy who ran it was, I think, Chinese or something. Anyway, he was a real nice guy. Yeah. Lloyd Loonskin didn't seem to be enjoying my stories that day. Man, you're owly, I said. What's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with me, he said. What are you talking about, you dummy? Yeah, well, you've been long gone, you, Lloyd Lunskin said. 2 summers and 1 winter since we've seen you, and well, what? Since you come back from the city, you're acting pretty cheeky, you. Now, this was one of the worst things you could say about anyone. Acting cheeky meant you were full of yourself, cocky, arrogant. You're just mad about Clyde Yazichipi, I said. Who? Yeah, right, I said. It was obvious Lloyd Lunskin was jealous. All you ever do is talk about yourself, said Lloyd Lunskin. I'm telling you what happened to me. Yeah, well, stuff happened to me too, okay? I was tempted to be sharp in my reply, something along the lines of, oh yeah? Or sure it did. But I was just sensitive enough to shut up. Yeah, we gotta move, my grandmother and me, said Lloyd Lunskin. While we'd been gone from Fort Vermilion, something major had occurred. The Catholic Church had sold their land to 2 businessmen, and the 2 businessmen had evicted everybody who lived on that land. Those people were squatters, it seemed, even though some of their houses had been built almost a century earlier. Nobody had ever thought to buy land or bother with who owned it. People would build a small house, usually out of squared-off logs, then chink it up with mud, maybe whitewash it, and move in. This had been going on for many generations until the Catholic Church decided to sell the land to speculators. One of these speculators was a Métis, Frank Jones. Frank Jones had money, real money. He was what you might call a professional Indian. Well known and well liked by the politicians down in Edmonton. He wore suits and ties, and he combed his hair straight back from his forehead. He was average size, but he looked smaller than he was. His shoulders might have had something to do with that. He didn't appear to have any. Bankers, lawyers, white people in general got along with Frank Jones fine. He could sit down in a fancy restaurant and use the right fork. Frank Jones had an exclusive contract for road repair in the area, and he convinced the provincial government to pay for his graders and gravel trucks. He owned the only gas pumps in town, and now he was bound and determined to open a hotel. Not that Fort Vermilion needed one. We didn't get that many visitors. But Frank Jones knew that building a hotel would give him the right to open a licensed beverage room. Frank Jones was going to bring alcohol to Fort Vermilion. No longer would thirsty people have to travel all the way to High Level to have a drink at the North Gate Hotel. They could stay right in town. Be a lot less drunk driving that way. Also, he was going to call the hotel the Sheridan Lawrence Motor Hotel, after one of the early pioneers to settle in the area, so that added a historical dimension to the operation. The only land he deemed suitable, being right downtown, was the land the Catholic Church owned. Was he concerned about the 30 or so families that were going to be evicted? Nope. The government was building them brand new houses. The Alberta Housing Corporation, backed by the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, was going to build the houses. The houses were hastily designed, cheaply made, and hurriedly built. They represented an attempt by the Government of Canada to get the Aboriginal population out of the bush and into buildings that looked more like the government's idea of real residences. This was also seen as a good way to add the logic and order of street addresses, something that had heretofore been missing. The houses came with oil heaters, electricity, and outdoor toilets. They built 24 of them in Fort Vermilion, all identical in design, but each with a different paint job to encourage individuality and pride of neighborhood. The development looked, Bud Pean said, like the kind of place where even if a fella comes home sober, he won't be able to find his own home. Nobody wanted to move into the new houses, despite the added amenities. Bud Pean decided to disassemble his cabin and move it deeper into the woods. But most people didn't have that kind of initiative or ability. Lloyd Lunskin was worried about his grandmother. She'd lived in her house for over 60 years. She'd been born there. So had Lloyd Lunskin. Where we live now, my grandma can walk to the post office or to the store. If we move to this new place, it's going to be too far for her to walk. The new housing development was way out on the edge of town, a good 3 or 4 miles from anything. I don't get it, said Lloyd Lunskin. Why does everything have to change? My mother always said later that that's when the town went downhill. After the evictions, it was never the same place again. Father Litzler took a lot of heat, but he had nothing to do with the church's decision. He was as upset about it as anybody else. Bud Pean turned to Augustus Noski for spiritual guidance. "Remember," said the old medicine man, "some white people are good, and some white people are not so good. Frank Jones is building the hotel. He's going to sell booze." "Well, some Indians are not so good as well," said Augustus Noski. "I'll pray for Frank Jones." "Pray his liquor license doesn't come through," said Bud Pean. Bud began regularly dropping off moose meat for my mother. After we returned from Saskatchewan, Bud Pean had become alarmed at the total lack of tree meat on our property and had taken to bringing over game whenever he could. My mother could have pointed out that we now had electricity and that one of the last purchases she and my father had made together was an electric fridge from the Eaton's catalog. We were broke, and our food was coming from our vegetable garden and Bud Pean's generosity. The only cost of his deliveries was that he would ask the same question of my mother every time. "Louise, have you heard from Hank at all?" "No, Bud, not one word." "Not a letter or nothing?" "No, Bud, I'm sorry, but nothing." "Well, maybe soon he'll write him." "You never know." "Or maybe he's going to phone him." "Oh, I don't think he'll call, Bud." "But maybe." "Stranger things have happened." "Well, if he calls, maybe you tell him I said hello." "I'll do that, Bud, if he calls," said my mother. "And thank you for the moose meat." Nobody in town blinked at my brand new baby sister. Lorna Joan was obviously some kind of Indian, but most people figured she was the result of a fling. Even Bud Pean thought my mother had maybe switched blankets while we were out of town, but she set him right. "Well, Louise, people think she's your kid, "Bud," said my mother, "Lorna Joan is my daughter." She tried to explain the principles involved in an open adoption, but Bud Pean found them too difficult to follow. "You want me to straighten everybody out?" "No, you can leave it be. Anybody who believes it isn't someone who knows me very well." "Don't take offense at it, anyways," said Bud Pean. "I won't, Bud," said my mother. "And thanks for the venison." My mother got herself hired part-time at the hospital to do bookkeeping and paperwork. It didn't pay a lot, but we made do. Lloyd Loonskin and I celebrated our 11th birthdays together. We had to go down to his new house because his grandmother couldn't make the walk up the hill. She was getting very old, and Lloyd was missing lots of school to stay with her. Neither of us got much in the way of presents. It wasn't a bad birthday. There was a cake with candles for Lloyd and me to blow out. "Make a wish," my mother said. I don't know what Lloyd Loonskin wished for, although he'd have told me if I'd asked. Maybe he wished for a bicycle or a hockey stick, or maybe for his grandmother to feel better. I wished that my father hadn't missed my birthday. He missed all of the birthdays that year. Christmas was tough too. Nobody got any presents, and you could tell my mom felt bad about that. We tried to make her feel better by pretending that we were too old for toys and stuff. We even went so far as to tell her we didn't believe in Santa Claus anymore, but we made sure not to say that if Lorna Joan or Billy was around. We were trying to cheer her up. I'm not sure it worked. We made it through the holidays, and then it was back to school. Winter went by, then a summer, then another winter, then one more summer. We didn't get a single letter from my father, let alone a phone call. My brother Dan tried to step in as the man of the household, but he wasn't good at it. He wasn't old enough to get a job, and his idea of helping my mother was to yell at us for not helping her out more. She was working full-time at the hospital now, which meant more money but longer hours. She'd finish work, then come home and get us fed and cleaned up and ready for the next day. The best musician to come out of Fort Vermilion was Bud Pean, and there is nobody who would argue that point. Bud was self-taught, but there didn't seem to be any instrument he couldn't pick up and figure out, and his voice had at least a 3-octave range. Bud Pean could growl deep and low like Johnny Cash or float up high and light like Roy Orbison. He won the talent show every year he entered, although he was always decent enough to give away the trophy to the person he felt came in second. Winning the talent show also got you a $50 prize, and Bud Pean did keep that check. He wasn't stupid. He didn't write any original songs, but he knew so many songs he was like a human jukebox. Bud Pean went through the windshield of his truck. It happened on the road leading out of Assumption as he was following Father Litzler. They had both been doing some work at the Aleski Shrine. Father Litzler was just coming around the hairpin corner that lets you out of Child's Lake back onto the road to Fort Vermilion when a moose ran out in front of him. He couldn't do anything but duck and, I guess, pray. His car was built low. It took the legs right off the moose, and the moose took the top right off the car. It was a horrible-looking accident. And Bud Pean was so shocked he kept going straight instead of turning. He went off the road and nosed down into a culvert. The sudden stop sent him through the windshield of his truck and out onto the hood. Father Litzler sat up, took a second to notice he was alive and unhurt, and went to find where Bud Pean had parked his truck. The moose was dying, but it was obviously in pain, and he wanted Bud to get his rifle and put the animal out of its misery. The priest stumbled around looking for Bud and his truck and his rifle until he noticed the trail into the culvert. Bud Pean looked much worse than the moose did. It's a good thing Father Litzler did so much physical work because he had to be strong to do what needed doing. He got Bud Pean off the hood of his truck and stretched him out in the back where he covered him with a blanket. He tried to stop the bleeding. There was a lot of blood coming out of the big man. Then he used a jack to lift the front of the truck. Then he used the winch Bud had on the front bumper to pull the truck out of the ditch. And then he used the sleeve of his shirt to clean some of the broken glass off the seat, and he drove that truck like a son of a bitch to St. Teresa's Hospital. The whole process, start to finish, took almost 3 hours, and there wasn't another car on the road the entire time. We went to visit Bud Pean in the hospital, and he was a frightful sight. His face had been cut so badly we wouldn't have recognized him. He'd broken his sternum and most of his ribs. His mouth was twisted sideways and stitched like a medicine bundle. He was alive, though, and everybody in town thought that was a pretty good deal. Bud was a tough guy. It would take more than going through a windshield to kill him. Father Litzler was considered a hero, not that he needed the praise since his standing in the community was already so high. The priest didn't have a mark on him, and the only damage he suffered was caused by Investors Group, his insurance company. They refused to pay the claim. They said hitting a moose was an act of God. We didn't recognize Bud Pean when he got out of the hospital. Not just because he'd lost so much weight, either. I don't know if it was the blunt force of the head injury or the loss of blood or the time it took to get him medical attention, but he was never the same after that accident. He had brain damage. He had trouble keeping his balance. He got migraine headaches that he took to treating with alcohol since it was the only thing that worked. After disapproving so strongly of Frank Jones and his new tavern, Bud would go on to become one of Frank's best customers. He had difficulty carrying on the most basic conversation. He stopped playing the guitar. He couldn't remember any songs. Bud had difficulty remembering people as well. I used to help him back to his house in the woods sometimes when he was too confused to find his way home. Sometimes we'd make it all the way there and he'd have no idea who I was. That would leave me with a sad, chalky feeling in the pit of my stomach. Other times his eyes would light up with recognition and his hideous face would break into a smile. "Hey, little partner, how you doing?" "I'm good, Bud." "Just a little bit further, Bud." "How's your dad, him?" "He's good, Bud. Just a couple more steps, Bud." "I ever tell you about the time him and me went prospecting up north?" "Yeah, Bud, I've heard those stories." "You know, your dad is the smartest man I ever met, me." "Yeah, well, I'll tell him you said that if I ever see him again." "Tell him I'll come up for a visit soon. I'll bring my guitar, eh?" "Yeah, you do that." Good night, Bud. To be honest, Bud could be a great big pain in the ass, especially when he started going on and on about stuff I already knew. Or when he talked about my father as if he was still living with us when he was God knows where and we hadn't heard from him in years. I was mostly grown up by this point, and I had better things to do with my time than drag the world's tallest Indian through the bush. My last winter in Fort Vermilion was the last time I saw Bud Pian. Lloyd Loonskin and I were at the back of the Legion Hall smoking cigarettes and flirting with girls and generally being loud and annoying. The talent show was on, and we were part of the merciless audience that would decide who would go home with the grand prize. The usual performers had come and gone. It was widely accepted that Edward Carrier would take first place that year. Edward Carrier would get up every year at the talent show and sing the one song he knew. He would always dedicate it to his wife. Denise Banks was next on stage. She performed an original work of poetry, accompanying herself on a native drum she had inexplicably painted green. Denise Banks was a huge white woman with a large bouffant that was suspiciously orange in color. She was married to Donald Banks, a man who hadn't had a bath since Lester B. Pearson collected his Nobel Peace Prize. For years, the two of them had been the proprietors of the only restaurant in town, the Trappers, Shacks, and Cafe, an old house with 3 small sheds that visitors could, hypothetically, rent for overnight accommodation. Mostly the shacks were occupied by people who lacked the wherewithal to find another place to stay. One of the long-term tenants was a skinny little man named Wachusk who had wandered down from the territories, had a nervous breakdown, and ended up collecting welfare checks in Fort Vermilion. Wachusk was mainly left alone, although it was fun to run up to him and ask him where his girlfriend was, which sent him into fits of rage. We all knew he'd never had a girlfriend in his life. Lloyd Loonskin had invented that game. If it sounds cruel, well, Lloyd only started taunting Wachusk the year his grandmother died and he was well and truly orphaned. Lloyd was 12 years old when she died. We both were. And I was trying to convince my mother to let him come and live with us when the problem was solved. Gene Rogers, of all people, decided to take Lloyd in and let him stay at the teacherage, and everybody agreed that was mighty Christian of him. Denise Banks finished her spoken word presentation, although we didn't know enough to call it that in those days. And Corporal Ladinsky, the master of ceremonies, came out to introduce the next act. He had a funny look on his face, and everybody stopped gossiping and listened. I'm pleased to announce our final act for the evening. This gentleman hasn't been here for a while, but we're sure glad to have him back. Let's give him a nice welcome, everybody. Here comes Bud Pian. The place went up like a rocket. We jumped to our feet and people were screaming and shouting and stomping their boots and whistling. Out Bud came, and he was still a big shambling mess of a man. He hadn't performed at a talent show since he went through the windshield of his truck, but here he was, carrying his guitar, and for a moment it looked as if anything was possible. Bud nodded shyly at the crowd, sat down on the stool that Corporal Ladinsky had brought out for him, and started to play. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Nobody could breathe. Bud Pian slowly and painfully picked out the only song he could remember how to play. A couple of times he looked as if he wasn't going to finish, but then he'd give a little shudder and keep on going. His voice was weak and shaky, and you could hear the words getting caught in his throat. It was probably the first song he had ever learned. The bear went over the mountain. The bear went over the mountain. The bear went over the mountain to see what he could see. As many times as I remember bad things about Fort Vermilion, as often as I think about what a hard place it could be, I remember that the people who lived there were sometimes capable of incredible kindness. There wasn't a sound in the Legion Hall until after Bud Pian finished, and then we were all on our feet again. Bud Pian won first place at the talent show, and that time he took the trophy home with him. He needed help getting back to his place because of how excited he was. It seemed like a small thing to do, and I was proud of him and proud of the town and proud that I was still his little partner. He was surrounded by people. They were wishing him well, pounding him on the back and pouring out praise. All the attention made Bud tired and confused. I took him by the arm, and he looked down at me, and he put his arms around me. He was smiling to beat the band. He smiled all the way back to his house. "Almost there, Bud." "That's good, eh? You did good tonight, Bud. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Hank. That means the world to me." "Bud, it's not Hank. It's me. My dad isn't here, remember?" "Hank, you remember that time we went prospecting in the north?" "It's not Hank, Bud. It's me." "Remember when we had that scrap with them city boys?" "Here's your place. Watch your head, Bud." "You know, Hank, that was the best time I ever had." "Go to bed, Bud. I'll see you later." "Hank." "Yes, Bud. You know, you're the smartest fellow I ever met." "Thanks, Bud. That means a lot." "And Hank." "What is it, Bud?" "We're friends, eh? Me and you." "Sure." Bud Pian died the next winter. He got confused and couldn't remember where he lived. He sat down in a snowbank to figure it out and froze to death. There wasn't anybody around to walk him home. There were more and more white people in Fort Vermilion. It seemed as if a new crop of folks from out was arriving every year. New houses were being built and more power lines were going up, and it was all happening because someone had figured out there was oil and natural gas in the north. That meant money and jobs, although neither of them seemed to be going to the Indians. Everything was speeding up, too, and that made some of the locals nervous. I thought it was fantastic. As far as I was concerned, they could tear the whole town down and build something new to replace it. Lloyd Loonskin and I were hanging out in front of the Sheridan Lawrence Motor Hotel. It was an impressive-looking structure, 2 stories high and made out of cinder blocks. The men working on it had all been brought up from Edmonton, and they were housed in Atco trailers. It may have seemed as if we were watching the construction, but really we were just wasting time. We were both 13, turning 14 in a few months. We were teenagers, which meant we wasted most of our time. "Look at that monkey." This was Lloyd Loonskin, and he seemed in a really grumpy mood. "Which monkey would that be?" "That guy over there. All he's doing is lifting stuff and carrying stuff." The guy in question did look a bit like a monkey, the way he used his arms and moved around the job site. "Well, what about him?" "Shit, I could do that." "Me too. What's your point?" "That guy? He's probably making $10 an hour." That doesn't seem right, does it, boys? This was a stranger talking. He had come up behind us and joined our conversation. He startled us both. "A project like this should be a boon to the local economy." Lloyd and I didn't know what to say. The man standing behind us had light brown hair, almost blonde, and the bluest of blue eyes. His hair was long and braided, and he was wearing a fringed buckskin jacket. It was everything we could do not to burst out laughing. He was the funniest-looking muniao we'd ever seen. "It's time for a change, and that's why I'm here," the man said. "Excuse me, mister?" said Lloyd Loonskin. "I'm here to start up an employment equity program, a new government initiative," the man explained. Neither of us had a clue what he was talking about, but the word government was enough to make Lloyd and me suspicious. "Nice talking to you," said Lloyd Loonskin. "See you," I said. "Wait," the man said, talking directly to Lloyd Loonskin. "A project like ours can help a young fellow like you become employable." "Yeah?" said Lloyd Loonskin. "What about him?" He jerked his thumb in my direction. "Well," the man said, "this project is specifically targeted at members of the First Nations." Neither of us had heard that expression. "It's an Aboriginal employment program," the man said. "Oh," I said. "Jobs for Indians," Lloyd Loonskin said. "Yes," the man said. "The goal is full employment for all our peoples." He actually did say peoples, and he put some spin on the word as if it meant something important. Lloyd Loonskin couldn't resist the opening. "What do you mean, our peoples, white man?" I missed the expression on the man's face because I was too busy falling down laughing, but Lloyd Loonskin told me later that the government man's face turned so red he almost did look like an Indian. With everyone else in town, we soon learned that the man's name was Andy Miracle, and he was a Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve in southern Ontario. That was so far away it was incomprehensible. Andy Miracle was in Fort Vermilion to start up a pilot project aimed at furthering employment or reducing the welfare rolls, whichever came first, and he wasn't having an easy time of it. The Indians in town kept making him pull out his treaty card to prove he had full status, and even then they didn't believe him. The idea behind the Aboriginal Initiative Opportunity, and that's what the pilot project was called, was to break the cycle of dependence. No, really, that's what it said in the brochure. There were a distressingly high number of families relying on welfare in Fort Vermilion. The fur trade was almost non-existent, and the lumber yard had been gone for years. Any job that did spring up like a flower in June was given to an outsider. Did the government decide to deal with any of these issues? No. What they came up with was the Aboriginal Opportunity Initiative, which meant that no able-bodied Indian male would be allowed to collect a welfare check. Instead, people would be paid the same amount of money every month to go around Fort Vermilion doing stuff, like fixing the swing set in the schoolyard, or picking up trash from the side of the road, or doing good deeds. It was a make-work project, and it pissed off people on welfare who would have gladly taken real jobs. They responded, as Indians often do when faced with official stupidity, by defaulting to their passive-aggressive worst or best, depending on your politics. The Indians made Andy Miracle repeat his instructions over and over again, as if they were hard of hearing or unable to understand simple commands. They did their assigned tasks as slowly as possible. Some even went as far as being rude, which was unusual, but Andy Miracle had earned their distrust early on. He'd held a sweetgrass purification ceremony on the first day of the project. The Bush Cree and Beaver Indians didn't know from sweetgrass. It was like offering communion to workers on a kibbutz. The intransigence of the local Aboriginal population may have been frustrating to Andy Miracle, but he had it coming. If he'd asked around, he would have found out there wasn't a single man in town who didn't want to work for a living. Except one. Tommy Francis was, hands down, the laziest man on earth. If there had been a world championship for laziness, he'd have been... Well, he probably wouldn't have shown up, so who knows what he would have done. It was breathtaking to see somebody that bone lazy, and it made him a celebrity. Tommy was so late on his first morning as a member of the Aboriginal Opportunity Initiative that Andy Miracle gave him a warning. "I'm putting a letter of reprimand in your file, Mr. Francis." The next day, Tommy didn't show up until after lunch. "This is your second warning, Mr. Francis." Tommy didn't show up at all on his third day with the program, and that earned him an angry visit from the initiative's leader. "I'm going to be crystal clear about my expectations, Mr. Francis. You either show up on time and fully participate, or you will be removed from the program." Tommy Francis shrugged. He'd never had a job, so he had no idea what being fired from one would be like. The shrug sent Andy Miracle over the edge. It's people like you, Mr. Francis, who give the rest of the Aboriginal community a bad name. Are you going to feel proud the next time someone calls a member of the Native community a lazy Indian? Are you?" Tommy Francis was actually proud of being a lazy Indian, and he didn't see why this would make Andy Miracle upset. It was none of Andy Miracle's business, really. Plus, he kept shouting, which was making Tommy Francis jumpy. "I don't understand you. There's no reason you should be behaving this way. It's not as if you're disabled." The word caught Tommy Francis's ear, and he stood up so fast he frightened his wife and children. "Andy," Tommy Francis said, "you've done your job. I'll be there tomorrow morning, bright and early." And so he was. He showed up on time and in his uniform of blue coveralls and yellow hard hat. The members of the Aboriginal Opportunity Initiative were cutting down brush at the riverbank that morning. Tommy Francis, whistling cheerfully, picked up an axe, went to a stump, removed his work boot, and cut his big toe off. "You did that on purpose," said Andy Miracle. He was driving Tommy Francis to the hospital, and his words came out as a snarl. "Nah," said Tommy Francis. "It was an accident." In the course of things, blood tests and x-rays and whatnot, it was discovered that Tommy Francis had an irregular heartbeat. He could have left his toe alone. He actually was disabled, just enough to get out of participating in the Aboriginal Opportunity Initiative. "I never thought being lazy would be such hard work," Tommy Francis said. Andy Miracle wasn't happy. "Can you hurry up with them forms?" said Tommy Francis. "I want to get them in the mail today. The sooner I send them out, the sooner those disability checks will start rolling in." Andy Miracle fled Fort Vermilion, and the government shut down the Aboriginal Opportunity Initiative. It wasn't because of anything Tommy Francis did, but because someone somewhere realized the program was a stupid idea. The government wouldn't leave us alone, though. The next thing you know, our MLA was coming to pay us a visit for the very first time. He had been elected to the legislature as part of Peter Lougheed's sweep to power, and he was going to be at the Legion Hall to make a big announcement. There had been some rumors about it, and almost everybody thought this was going to be trouble. Here's what Louise McNabb had to tell us. The government of Alberta, in partnership with Ottawa, was going to spend $7 million to build a bridge across the Peace River. The ferry boat I'd managed to destroy before I was born had been replaced by one powered by a tugboat, and now the end of the ferry was at hand. One of the obvious sites for the bridge was on sacred land. The land was so sacred and so holy that they weren't allowed to talk about it to anyone from outside, and that included the government. Father Litzler and Corporal Ladinsky were concerned about local jobs, and they had taken an instant dislike to the new MLA. But they didn't know about the sacred land either. And now Frank Jones was standing up to say something. "Most of you know I own that plot of land upriver," said Frank Jones, "near Rocky Lane." There was murmured assent. 100% of them knew that. "Well, that's got some people worried because they think maybe that's where this new bridge might go," he continued. "Well," said Frank Jones, "that's not going to happen." Louis McNabb dropped his pencil. "My good friend Louis McNabb here and I certainly discussed that possibility, but I've decided it's important to leave that property alone. The bridge will go somewhere else, and I think that's a fine thing." Frank Jones sat back down. It was a toss-up as to who looked more shocked by his announcement, the people in the room or Louis McNabb. Frank Jones would have made a killing selling that land to the government, and it was not in his nature to pass up an opportunity to make a buck. What happened? Money happened, is what. It wasn't until 6 months later, when the location of the bridge was officially announced, that it all became clear. Frank Jones had sold the section with the sacred land to his good friend Warren Pritchard. That's because he'd already learned the government was going to build the bridge 100 yards west of the ferry landing, nowhere close to there. The project meant more workers showing up from the city. The more white people came, the more Indians left, looking for work mainly or better prospects. Father Litzler died, and he was buried at the Aleski Shrine. The next day, the Indians built a spirit house over his grave. Fabian Noski packed up his family and moved them away. His granddaughter was Lucy Noski. His grandfather was Augustus Noski, the last of the medicine men. I went to see Augustus the month I turned 14. It wasn't my idea. Lloyd Lunskin made me do it. "You should take him a present, you," Lloyd Lunskin said. "He saved your life, and now you're a man, and you should thank him properly." "I may not be a kid anymore, but I'm not a man," I said. "Man enough," said Lloyd Lunskin. "Take him some tobacco." Augustus Noski and his wife, Sophie, seemed glad to see me when I stopped by for a visit. We sat down at the kitchen table. "Elder," I said, "I brought you a present." "Thank you," he said. "You're a good boy." Augustus Noski rolled a cigarette. "There's too many white people around here these days." "There sure are," I said. Then, catching his expression, "You can't mean me." I was trying to make a joke. "You made me an Indian." "Maybe," he started chuckling. "We'll see." For some reason I felt sad. And the harder he laughed, the sadder I got. It was the strangest damn thing. "You know what?" the old medicine man said. "With this new bridge, everybody will be able to find us now. More white people are going to come in and try and help us. You know what? It was better before, when they didn't know we were here, when they left us alone." "But things are easier now," I said. "It's progress." I wasn't thinking only about the bridge. I was thinking about indoor toilets and electricity and television and all the other improvements that had happened in Fort Vermilion since I was a little boy. The medicine man closed his eyes. He looked as if he was going to sleep. "We can't keep living in the past," I said. Augustus Noski opened his eyes and slowly got to his feet. "I think maybe you shouldn't come back here to visit again," he said. He said it so kindly, I felt like bursting into tears. "Just because something is easier," he said, and he was already closing the door on me, "doesn't mean it's better." It was the longest trip you could ever take. It wasn't the distance, although it was pretty far, but it was the time it took and what that time took from you. The journey was made easier if you had good company. Someone you liked. I had Lloyd Lunskin. He was going along with me as far as Peace River. It was the end of my last summer in Fort Vermilion. I was 15 years old, and I had convinced my mother to let me go to high school in the city. My brother Dan had already left home. Getting to Edmonton meant taking the bus. It was a school bus, painted white and green. It didn't have air conditioning or proper heating or a washroom in the back. It made one trip a day to High Level. It left Fort Vermilion at 9 in the morning, and if you were fortunate, you made it to the Greyhound bus terminal in High Level in the nick of time for the noon bus to Peace River. The next part of the trip took 8 hours, with stops in every town along the way. Then you waited at the Peace River Depot until the bus from Edmonton showed up. It didn't leave until 10:30 p.m. The last part of the trip took 4 hours, getting you into the city at almost 3 in the morning. Total distance traveled, 526 miles. Time spent in transit, almost 18 hours. Lloyd Lunskin and I hadn't seen much of each other that summer. He'd spent it hauling supplies in and out of the bush for forest fire crews, which paid considerably more than my job pulling weeds at the experimental farm. I'd saved $846, which was enough to get me heading south. Lloyd had saved enough money to move out of the teacherage he'd shared with Gene Rogers. The previous summer, Lloyd and I had spent a month together in a tent in a campground in southern Manitoba. My mother had sent Dan, Sean, and me down to spend some time with my father. He had somehow ended up in Brandon teaching at the university there. "Hey, partner, remember when we went camping with your dad that time?" Of course I do. How could I not remember? Lloyd hadn't stopped talking about the trip since we got back. He was getting as bad as Bud peeing. "He didn't know I was coming, eh?" No, he knew. You weren't a surprise or anything. It's not like my mom didn't tell him. Yeah, he was Sir Owly then, him. He wasn't mad at you, Lloyd. He was mad because my mother didn't stick around and wait for him. How come your mom didn't wait for your dad? I don't think she wanted to see him, I said. Or maybe she knew he wasn't going to be on time. My father had been an hour and a half late picking us up. I didn't think we'd be camping out, me. Me neither, Lloyd. I thought we'd stay in an apartment. Whenever I tell people that my father put the 4 of us in a tent in the middle of Brandon's Curran Park for a month, leaving us to fend for ourselves, they react with astonishment and disapproval. It's not as if he totally abandoned us, though. He stopped by every weekend to drop off food and money. That was, sir, a good time, that one, Lloyd Lunskin said. It was the best time, I said. The bus was reaching the outskirts of High Level, and I'd started to feel nervous. We sure had us some fun, Lloyd Lunskin said. We did at that. There was a creek running through the campground, so we went swimming every day and cooked hot dogs over an open fire, and I figured out how to get free pop from the machine beside the concession stand. When my father dropped by on weekends, he brought along a younger woman he introduced as our cousin. That didn't fool us for a second. The Fort Vermilion bus lurched to a stop. We climbed down, knocked as much of the road dust off each other as we could, and climbed on board the Greyhound for Peace River. The Peace River bus pulled out of the gravel parking lot and onto the highway. I was excited. It had taken me 3 tries to get my duffel bag properly stored in the overhead bin. You gave your mom half your summer money, right? That's right. I had actually given her $300, but I figured that was close enough. But you're okay for money? I'm good, I said. Remember what my father always used to say? If you're in an interesting place and you've got $50 in your pocket, Lloyd jumped in to join me on the last part, you rule the world. That's how we passed the time. 2 good friends, best friends, shooting the breeze and reminiscing. What are you going to do when you get to Edmonton? Well, let's see. I'll find a place to live and get some kind of weekend job, I guess. What school are you going to? Don't know yet, I said. I'm going to look up the biggest school in the city and go to that one. Yeah, he said. Probably schools down there with a couple of 100 students. Lloyd, there are schools down there with 1,000 students. That's something, eh? More people than in our whole town. Hard to imagine. My brother lives in an apartment in Calgary, and there's 1,200 people in his building. Hey, partner, remember that time? And we were back to talking about the past again. That carried us through almost the rest of our trip. The sun dipped below the tree line, tossing long shadows across the highway. We continued our conversation, but the cool blue nightfall made us talk in whispers. Hey, Lloyd Lunskin said, you ever get the strap from Gene Rogers? Oh, come on, I said. It was odd for Lloyd to ask a question he already knew the answer to. On the rear, he said, or only on the hand? On the hand, I said. 3 hits on each hand, just like you, just like everybody else. Never on the rear. Nah. We were tired by now, yawning, and we fell silent until we got to the hill leading down into Peace River. We're here, said Lloyd Lunskin. We dragged my duffel bag outside and left it stacked with the other luggage, waiting for the bus south. Down the hill a bit, we found a Chinese restaurant about to close, and we grabbed a meal there. After that, we strolled around a bit, looking at the sights. This place is ever big. Not as big as Edmonton, I said. Big enough, he said. Bigger than Fort Vermilion, I said. It's big in Fort Vermilion sometimes, Lloyd Lunskin said. It's small and big at the same time. It was dark on the street. I couldn't see Lloyd's face, but his voice sounded like a stranger's. We started back up the hill. "You're being brave," said Lloyd Lunskin. "You're not scared?" I was terrified, but staying behind, not ever getting out, frightened me even more. "No," I said, "not really." "Remember that time we went camping together?" "Yeah," I said. "That was a good time," Lloyd Lunskin said. "You'll come down?" I said. "Even if only for a visit?" "I doubt it," he said. "I don't think I'd like living away from home." For some reason, that made me angry. "Come with me," I said. "Right now, climb on the bus." "You're lucky," he said. "You can just leave." "So can you," I said. "What's this lucky crap?" "You were born lucky," Lloyd Lunskin said. "Not me. I was maybe lucky to be born." I put my arm around his shoulder. "Come to Edmonton," I said. "We'll get a place together, find jobs, chase girls, have some fun." "No," he said. "This is as far as I go." We turned past the buzzing Rexall Drugs sign. We were almost at the bus depot. "When Gene Rogers gave me the strap, he always hit me on the rear," Lloyd Lunskin said. "He never did that to you, huh?" I shook my head. "Sometimes he'd make you take your pants down and strap you on the bare behind." I didn't say anything. "Sometimes his hand would move," said Lloyd Lunskin. My ears were making this rushing sound, and it was hard to think of anything to say. "But that never happened to you?" "No," I said. "It never did." "You were lucky." "I guess so," I said. "Hey," Lloyd Lunskin said. "That's my bus there. People are already getting on." Lloyd got on, and the door swung shut, and the brakes hissed, and the bus slowly pulled out. The air felt cold, and I gave a little shudder. I went into the depot and bought myself a cup of hot chocolate from a vending machine. Then the cold was gone, and I was too hot, as if I had a fever. I was thinking about what my best friend had told me. I stared at my reflection in the window of the bus station, stared through myself and out into the night. I didn't tell him that Gene Rogers had tried to give me the strap on the rear after my father left town. When he pulled down my pants, I pulled them back up and turned round and yelled at him not to touch me, or I would tell my mother, and she would tell my father, and my father would come back to Fort Vermilion, and he'd have to answer to him. I could have said, "It wasn't only you. There's nothing special about you, Lloyd. He's evil, that's all. Gene Rogers is evil, and that's all there is to it." That would have been a good thing to tell Lloyd Lunskin. I was falling asleep on a bench by the time the bus arrived. It had started to rain, so I got my jacket out of my duffel bag and put it on. There was an envelope in one of the pockets. When I pulled it out, I saw that Lloyd Lunskin had written my name on it. Inside the envelope was a $50 bill. I had never seen one. Written on the back of the bill was, "Good luck, partner," and "I'll see you soon." No, you won't, I thought. I'm never coming back, and I shall never see you again. I did see Lloyd Lunskin one more time. It was a big year for me. I was turning 30. My first play had been produced, and my second one was in rehearsals. I had, surprisingly, fallen in love for the first time in my life. I had partnered up with a friend to run a new comedy club, and I was starting to become world famous all over Edmonton. Best of all, I hadn't had a drink in almost a year. I was inside the club getting ready for the first performance of a new improv show when I heard a ruckus in the lobby. The box office girl came rushing in to find me. "Sunny," I said, because that was her name. What's going on? There's a drunk Indian in the lobby and he wants to come inside. I sighed and went out into the lobby. Hey, partner, long time no see. Christ on a popsicle stick. There he was, live and in person, Lloyd Loonskin. He didn't look that drunk, but man, did he look old. He could have passed for 50, even though we are the exact same age, give or take a day. Lloyd? I said. Is that you? Don't you recognize me? Yeah, of course. What are you doing here? Came to see you, he said. He made a sweeping arm gesture to include the lobby. Came to see your show. Great, I said. Let's talk outside. We went and stood on the sidewalk. It was cold out there. Lloyd was telling me that he had hitchhiked down from Jean d'Or Prairie where he was living and decided to look me up. I could see his breath while he talked. How'd you find me? I said. He gave me a grin and pulled a small book out of his jacket. It was a child's diary, but there wasn't any writing in it, just some newspaper articles glued to the page. See, partner? Lloyd Loonskin said as we paged through the book. This is a review of that show you did in Calgary. This is from that theater magazine. Where'd you get these? Your mom, she sent them to me, he said. I asked her. The most recent article had been in the newspaper the day before. He had already glued it into his scrapbook. That's how I knew where to find you, he said. We talked a little longer, and then I said I had to get back to work. I lied and told him the show was sold out. It was opening night, and I had enough things to worry about. Some other time, I said. Sure, he said. Next time. I gave him some money, forced him to take it. We shook hands. Lloyd Loonskin was halfway down the block when he turned around and came running back, holding up the handful of bills I had given him. Hey, partner! You keep it, Lloyd. You keep that money. No, I wanted to say something. What? I don't blame you. I didn't bother asking him what he meant. There were so many choices. I forgot about Lloyd Loonskin for a couple of days. I was reading the Saturday paper hoping to find a review of my new show when I spotted the story about him. There weren't many details provided. Aboriginal, blah, blah, blah. Intoxicated, blah, blah, blah. Exposure. They spelled his name wrong. They got his age wrong, too. He was only 29. Whoever wrote that story about Lloyd Loonskin missed the most important part. Sometimes it just runs in the family. Lloyd Loonskin was lucky to be born. I was born lucky.